Welcome everybody. My name is Rob Fenstermacher. I'm the CEO of Cultural Vistas, and as Emily said, we're really happy that we have such a good turnout tonight. This is the first time we've tried to do an event like this where we are taking a cultural event and trying to broadcast it to all of our participants around the country. We've done, as you all know, hopefully events that are baseball-oriented, cultural events that you can participate in, but we haven't done a lot of events that are focusing on other cultural issues here in the United States, such as politics. And we thought this would be a great topic given this year, given that we have the presidential election coming up, to provide you with some more information about some of the things that you're experiencing, some of the things that you might be discussing with colleagues at work or with friends that you've met during your time, maybe with colleagues that you're living with. So again, I think this is going to be a really exciting experience. As you all know as well, part of the experience that we want you all to have while you're here in the United States is not just the professional experience, but really to get a cultural insight of what the American people are like. So we're really lucky tonight to have Trooper Sanders, who is a true expert on U.S. politics. He's going to give us a sense about what makes U.S. politics tick here in the United States. And I'll give you a little bit of background about him. Trooper is the founder of Wise Whisper. It's a social cause practice helping leaders, companies, and nonprofit organizations develop new and maximize the effectiveness of existing initiatives tackling critical social challenges. He also serves as a senior advisor for public sector initiatives at an organization called Hello Wallet. It's a technology startup that helps people manage their money better and save more. And I think that we can all benefit from that. As you know, our country's in debt and a lot of individuals. So hopefully he's teaching people how to manage their money better.
And learning how to.
Yes. Most recently, Trooper served as Deputy Director of Policy to U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama. Previously, he was Domestic Policy Advisor to former U.S. President Bill Clinton. During the 2004 election season, he founded an organization called Time to Vote, a campaign encouraging employers to provide workers with flexible leave on election day so that they can vote. And I'm proud to say here at Cultural Vistas, we actually make it a holiday so everybody gets the entire day off to go and vote and ensure they're participating in the political process. He has also served as a communications advisor to the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. And one thing that we think is really special, he was also a participant in one of our fellowship programs overseas. He participated back in 2002, 2003 in a program called the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program, and spent the year doing 2 different professional assignments, one with Transparency International and the other with Ashoka. So he also has had an experience similar to yourselves, but was overseas. So this is one way to sort of bring back our Americans and give back to the international participants who are here in the U.S. And lastly, his government service began as a White House policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore and Tipper Gore. So we are really privileged to have you here today and looking forward to the conversation. As Emily mentioned, we've got a number of different questions that we've lined up, and hopefully it'll end up being a nice conversation. But before I do that, I skipped over one point. I wanted to get a sense of where you all are from overseas. So do we have anybody here from Germany? Good, from anybody from Canada? Oh, someone told me we were going to have Canadians here. Shoot.
They don't come out in the rain, I guess.
Yeah, aren't they? Doesn't it rain
and
a lot
ice,
in
yes.
Canada?
Rain now.
Do we have anybody here from Korea? Okay, probably Korea West program. Okay. How about Ghana? Excellent. And Moldova? Aha, that's our most exotic place, I think so far. And what country did I miss? Okay, where are you from?
Senegal.
Senegal.
Spain.
Spain.
Italy.
Italy, excellent.
France.
France.
Poland.
Poland, excellent.
Holland.
Holland, excellent, okay. Well, I think this is helpful for you to know,
Yes.
for a little bit, to compare a little bit of the political systems in the different countries to here in the United States. So, with that, I will start. And we thought we'd give you a little bit of an understanding of the two-party system. I know that many of you are probably coming from countries that have parliamentary systems with a lot of different parties. And so I was curious if you could tell us a little bit, how did that develop, that we now have a two-party system, and what are some of the advantages or disadvantages of that?
I think, a lot, if you look at the beginning of American history, a lot of the growth of parties, at one point it was the Whigs. Actually, the Republican Party didn't begin until the mid-1800s with President Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic Party, as we know it now, was actually at one point called the Democratic Republican Party by one of our early presidents, Thomas Jefferson. A lot of the interests, and one thing that probably still has its fingerprints on American politics today are regional interests. And when the country was first founded, a lot of the interest came around either the more industrialized or urbanized north and northeast, where we are in New York and Massachusetts, et cetera, in the New England area, versus the more agricultural-based south. And then as the country expanded west. And so the Northeast had more urbanized, had a larger population. The South had fewer people, more land, and so a lot of the issues that you'll both see in how our government is structured in our Constitution, and in some cases how the parties developed, really came out of how those different groups balanced their interest in making sure that the urbanized Northeast didn't dominate the less populated South, the more agricultural South, and vice versa. The other part that it's just a fact of our history that we should put out there is that at one time it was an issue around slave and free Americans, and you will see that in parts of our Constitution of how while having American slaves, how to count at least a part of that population. At one point, slaves were counted as part of a human being when it came to a state's representation in Congress, but of course didn't have any. Not having voting rights was frankly the least of the challenges. And so you will, I don't want to overplay this, but even today you will see some of the splits in our politics along different types of regional lines or urban and rural and suburban. And so, but at the same time, I should say that with our two parties, what you see today with Democrats and Republicans, 40, 50 years ago, probably 50 years ago, the Democratic Party had many people who today are Republicans, and that began to change towards the late 1960s and early 70s when Franklin Roosevelt, who's one of our more famous presidents, was president. He had a tricky time balancing northern urban Democrats and southern Democrats whose interests, were staunchly pro racial segregation, and again to raise a vivid issue in our history, Northern Democrats campaigned with Franklin Roosevelt to pass laws banning lynching, hanging individuals. And to be perfectly frank, politically, Franklin Roosevelt couldn't do that because he needed Southern Democrats in the Senate and in Congress to support the New Deal, his Social Security, and other forms of legislation. And so you find that you have to make some fairly tough and nasty decisions. On the other hand, to balance it with the Republican Party, at one point that was more dominated by liberal or progressive, but wealthier individuals. Progressive on, say, racial issues because more of them were based in, say, the Northeast of the United States, or say with Richard Nixon, who was one of our presidents. He was from California. They didn't have the same sort of racial issues. And so at one point in our time, on certain issues, you could say the Republican Party was a little more progressive and the Democratic Party was a little more conservative. So it's all been a bit of a jumble that's changed with history.
So this leads us, I think, to the next issue of why is it that a third party hasn't been able to develop? Is it partially what you were talking about, that the larger parties tend to change over time and adapt to issues? What explains that? And could a third party ever have a chance? Or are there structural things in our political system that keep that from happening?
I think part is how our government, at least on the national level, I'll talk a little bit about the local level, where I think there may be potentially more room for the third party if they were able to get enough support. But nationally, our government, unlike, say, in the Netherlands or Germany, more of a parliamentary style democracy where you were trying to get a majority of support to form a government, particularly with a presidential style system where it's winner take all. If you can get the number of votes, and we'll talk about it later, the electoral college, it doesn't really matter that someone got 5 or 10%. If they didn't get the 50% of the electoral votes, they don't form the next government. And so I think because so much is built around, at least from a real administrative point of view, the presidency, that makes it very difficult for, say, a Green Party to really come up and build enough support, raise enough money. One of the key issues in American politics is cash, and it's I think this year people are estimating that campaigns are going to raise $1 billion to run their campaigns, and there have been all sorts of conversations around should we limit or regulate how much money is in politics, but our Supreme Court has said that money equals speech in politics, and you can't restrict or overly restrict what people spend in politics because that will limit their ability for their voices to be heard. And so that creates a lot of barriers for folks who may have different interests to create smaller parties. But what I do think you have is within the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, you may have a lot of people who have, say on the Democratic side, you may have people who are more conservative to far, far left-wing. I'll only say this in this room, it would create a huge, if it was in public, but, folks who may in other countries lean towards being close to being socialist. I'm not saying the Democratic Party is a socialist party because that's a whole other political issue in the U.S. Whereas as on the Republican side, whereas say in Germany, you have the Free Democratic Party that is more sort of classically free market economic, laissez-faire, and then you have the Christian Democrats who bring a slightly more sort of social and faith-based conservatism to politics. In the U.S., you have all of that lumped into one party, which can frankly create a lot of conflict inside of the party. And you'll hear a lot about the Tea Party, or you've heard a lot about the Tea Party this year on the Republican side. And that is our group of people who are conservative who feel that the Republican Party has been too left-wing and they've been too progressive. And so they have pulled, or trying to pull the party to the far right. When one of my former bosses, Bill Clinton, was president, he was known as a New Democrat, which was supposed to mean more of a centrist progressive, a centrist Democrat that did not completely bring a lot of the far left-wing issues into actually governing. But one thing that you should keep in mind is that even though they aren't called a third party, there is a third party in the U.S. in many ways. It's called the independent swing voter. It's people who aren't Democrat or Republicans and who will, sometimes they can be persuaded to go either way. Sometimes that's based on issues. Sometimes that's based on which candidate seems to be more likable or which candidate seems to be the stronger candidate. And other times, frankly, it's based on the candidate who may just have more momentum because, if you're undecided, the last thing you want to do is go vote for someone you think is going to lose. So that's where you will see between now and November all of the candidates, be it at the presidential level or in some of the Senate and congressional races that aren't in staunchly liberal or staunchly conservative districts. That's who you see everyone is going after. So that's our third party. It's just not named.
And in cases of third parties like Ralph Nader that we have here, we've had Ross Perot in the past, do they have any influence? They may not win, and they may get 10% or 15%, or I think Ross Perot got 20%. Are they influencing the elections in any way?
You know, I think they can. I think it is safe to say that Ross Perot, because he was able to attract enough attention, and frankly, he had the money in 1992, that he created a much more difficult election race for President Bush Sr. And you know, I'm not saying that President Bush would have won necessarily if Ross Perot were not in the race, but it forced, I think actually Ross, I may be forgetting this, well actually President Clinton won the state of Montana. And what we'll go into is that really a presidential election is really 50 different state elections. It's not a national election. And Montana is a fairly conservative, actually very conservative state. And President Clinton probably would not have won Montana without the Ross Perot voters. In 2000, and I sort of felt this in a fairly direct and visceral way, Ralph Nader was able to attract enough support in the state of Florida, and that state, and hence the presidency, was decided by less than 1,000 votes. And so he got several thousand votes in Florida, and they were probably voters who, assuming they went to vote, would have voted for Al Gore. And so if Ralph Nader were not in the race, I think there's a fairly safe argument to say that there would have been a President Gore.
So they do have an influence.
They do have an
in a different
influence,
way.
absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about how we get to the nomination. And you can see we got a question from a Facebook participant asking why some states have caucuses and others have primaries, and wanting to know what the difference is. And I know you've probably all heard about the Iowa caucuses. It's the first thing that took place, and then it's followed up by the New Hampshire primaries. So what's the difference between those, and why?
Well, essentially a caucus would almost be like what we're doing right now, where on the election night, the group of people in a particular neighborhood or community would come together at an appointed time at 6:30, and they would get in a room, they'll close the door, and then everyone decides, okay, who's for which candidate? Are you for Mitt Romney or Santorum? And you go, literally in Iowa's case, you will go into different corners and count off who's for whom. And then at some point, you will try to persuade your neighbor to come over to my side. And so it's a very intimate process, and this takes place all across the state. Whereas a primary is just like a normal election day, where you go to your ballot station, you know, you tick off who you want to vote for, and you cast your ballot. Practically, that changes how you, if you're a candidate, how you campaign. And so in a primary situation, you're really just trying to hit as many people as possible. And so, you know, the television ads, and it's all about getting out your vote on election night. With a caucus, it's in some ways it's much more intimate, because yes, you want, you know, 10,000 people to show up, but frankly, you're focusing just as much on, can we get 50 people in, you know, the Upper East Side of Manhattan to show up in this room, not just say with a primary, you have between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. to vote anytime during the day, but can you actually get the 50 people to show up at 6:30 p.m. on a specific night and support you, and actually sit in front of their friends and their neighbors and publicly show who you support? And so that takes us a higher level of engagement and commitment and connection. And so you find with the Iowa caucuses that we've just seen the Republicans go through, you know, you see people who, you know, a year or two later are presidents of the United States and flying around in the big plane and all that, where they, you know, they're showing up with you know, dinner and a gallon of milk to someone's house, hoping that they'll get 5 of their friends to go to a caucus, because that's what really matters. Whereas if you're in the California primary, you're running your ads, and you know, it's just a much larger situation. In general, and actually you are seeing this right now, even now that Mitt Romney is really, the presumptive Republican, where Ron Paul, who is one of the, well, until I think yesterday when he said he would no longer travel, he is still getting support in these caucus states because, I mean, they're his diehard supporters. So even if you can get 5 of your people in a room, that can make a difference, and you can compete for the vote.
Sort of related to that, you just said the presumptive nominee, this wasn't, it's an add-on question, but what do people need to get the nomination
So
of their party?
Right. So in August, and I want to say the Democratic convention is in September, that's when the parties formally select their nominees, and you need delegates pledged. So let's say that everybody here is 100% of the Republican delegates for the convention. Mitt Romney needs to make sure that he gets 50% plus 1, at least, of the delegates to that convention to be the official nominee. In modern times, it really has been almost a rubber stamp. By the time you get to your convention, the person who's in the lead has far more delegates, so that it really isn't an issue. However, even, I want to say, at least on the Democratic side, the last truly contested convention was when President Kennedy was running for the nomination. And he still didn't quite have enough delegates at his convention to secure the nomination, and so there was still horse trading going on behind, they used to call it the smoke-filled rooms, where you're saying, well, can you give, what can you give Lyndon Johnson to get his support, or what can you give whoever someone else had that may have had a few delegates, to where it was really a battle. Now, that said, this issue can actually defeat sitting presidents. In 1976, Ronald Reagan challenged President Gerald Ford. Now, Ronald Reagan probably knew that he wasn't going to defeat a sitting president, Gerald Ford, for the actual nomination, but he was able to get enough support and kick up enough dust that, to have a sitting president show up at his own convention, which really should just be kind of a party and a coronation, actually having to listen to someone else who opposes you, give a speech, and get some acclamation, it kind of deflates who the president is. Later in 1980, Ted Kennedy challenged President Jimmy Carter, and so it just sets the tone of the race. That, again, when you're trying to go after those swing voters, and they're sitting back saying, well,
their own party won't accept you.
Exactly. What's wrong with you? If your own party doesn't like you, or you expect the president to look sort of strong, and they're over here doing kind of political horse trading, that can help influence an election.
So you touched on this a little bit. What is it that you think people are looking for in a president? I mean, what are they trying to bring out? What do the surveys say American voters are looking for when they say, I want Barack Obama or I want Mitt Romney to be my president?
I think there are two things with a president. The bottom line is people ask, what's going to make my life better? And either does this president or the candidates, in the case where there isn't a sitting president, what this candidate represents, are they going to make my life better? Am I going to have a job? Do they reflect my values? And particularly if you hold certain beliefs particularly strongly, does that candidate reflect that? And so really people are voting for what's in their wallet, what's happening with their family. But I think there's also a second piece that's more intangible. Say, unlike Greece, for example, or Italy, where there's a president who is doesn't have political power, but sort of ceremonially represents the country and should be a unifying figure. And then you have a prime minister who everybody throws tomatoes at, and because they're doing all the governing. Or in the Netherlands, where you have a monarch who doesn't have formal political power, although may have to spend a little bit of time helping to shepherd a government being formed now, but where government happens with the prime minister. In the U.S., we've combined those roles. So we've taken the monarch or the ceremonial president and combined it with our prime minister. And so that's where the personality of the candidates matter, and where people have to look and say, does this person, beyond like, are they going to do whatever needs to happen so that I have a job and my kids have a school to go to, do they represent who I am as an American and what I want to believe is this country as an American, both here and to some extent overseas, to some extent. And so there have been issues where, you know, in the 1980 election, where folks have said that President Carter, while he certainly had a number of policy challenges, you know, he was a plain-spoken man who, you know, people used to say he carried his own briefcase up the plane on Air Force One, and people say, well, we don't want to see our president carrying his own jacket in his briefcase. Like, you know, you're the president. You need to look the part. You know, President Kennedy, I think, and particularly in 1960, where when he was, there was a famous debate that he had with Richard Nixon, and you know, where Richard Nixon had, you know, he hadn't shaved, and it was warm in the room, so he was sweating a little bit, and you know, he had on a white shirt, so in black and white TV, he just looked sort of flush, and you know, and President Kennedy, or then candidate Kennedy, just looked fresh and looked like, all right, here's somebody who I think kind of represents me. And so that piece, you know, in my opinion, I actually think plays more of a role than when you're a voter and you want to think you're pretty smart and you're rational. I think all those little things actually make a difference.
Excellent. I'm sure there'll be questions on that later. I think the next one is, you hear a lot of talk about the importance of the vice presidential candidate that the president might pick. Mm-hmm. And as we're all probably aware, there was a lot of focus on that in the 2008 election with the selection of Sarah Palin. And there's lots of media coverage given to this issue. Is it really as important as it seems? I mean, why is this such an important decision, and how does it in fact influence the election in any way?
And I say this having worked for a vice president, so I probably shouldn't say it this way. When it comes right down to it, no. I think when some scholars have gone back and analyzed the elections, they found that the vice president, in terms of how people actually vote, may have a 1 or 2% effect on the actual vote. Now, that's not to say that the vice presidency isn't important and you should think about it, because, you know, it's sort of one heartbeat away from, you know, pretty important job. You know, one former vice president a long time ago, you know, I'm going to clean it up a little bit, said that the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit. Because once you're there, you know, unless the president gives you things to do, you don't have much to do unless the president, you have a strong relationship with the sitting president. But what I do think the vice presidency, the nominee pick, what it does do is it gives that, for the busy person who has a job and kids and just a life, like they aren't watching politics all day, it gives that, you know, that 20-second moment that you spend looking at the news and you're trying to just get an impression of the candidate. It gives you that sense of, who is this person? And so when Senator McCain picked Sarah Palin, what he was trying to get across was, you know, I'm actually more energetic than people are thinking that I am as a, you know, 70-plus-year-old senator. So he picks a, you know, an energetic young governor that folks haven't heard from. So it, you know, the idea was that people would take a second look at John McCain. In 1992, when Bill Clinton picked Al Gore, you know, the textbook reason why you pick a vice president is to pick up a state. And so John F. Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson, not because he loved Lyndon Johnson, but because Lyndon Johnson could deliver Texas and put him over the top of winning the presidency. Or you want some regional balance. If you're from the South, and let's say if you're a Republican, and you're from the South, you may want to look at a governor or a senator from Michigan or Ohio to try to get the Midwest. Bill Clinton changed that. He was from governor of Arkansas, and he picked Al Gore, who was a senator from Tennessee. And so, you know, why would you pick two Southern men in that type of an election? Well, what he wanted to, well, two things. I mean, he will say that one, he interviewed folks, and he actually wanted to make sure that if something happened to him, he wanted to pick somebody who could run the country. But it also, and I can actually remember, and this is before I was even involved in politics. It was actually my first election, and until that point, you know, President Clinton, then Governor Clinton, was the front runner, but there were all these controversies, and you know, the tabloid press, and you know, it just wasn't quite sure, was this actually going to like stick? And I remember working, it was in the summer when he picked Al Gore, and people just went, oh, got it. Here were two young men with their, you know, energetic wives, and just that picture of the four of them, two young politicians with their, you know, two energetic young wives, and that picture just sent a signal that said, okay, a new generation is trying to lead the country. And it sort of threw the you know, the Republicans off their stride for a little bit.
We have another question that came in from Facebook talking about the campaign and what it's like to be out on the campaign trail. The specific question is, do you think Obama has created a good enough record to show during the current campaign, or is he still relying on concepts more than data?
Well, I'm obviously going to give a slightly biased. Let me start with what the Republicans will say. The Republicans will say that the country is not in better shape, that, you know, it's the old classic line that Ronald Reagan asked during his campaign. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And so what the Republicans are going to try to do is appeal to people who aren't hard Democrats or hard Republicans, again, those undecided voters who can go either way, and they're going to try to say, you know, our economy is still in bad shape. You're still worried about if you're going to have a job. You're still worried about your children's future. And President Obama, they won't say president. You know, they'll just say Obama, because you don't want to give him the accoutrements of the office. Hasn't done his job. And so you want to just see that doubt in people. So they say, all right, let's just try something new. What the president has to do is make the case that we have been through obviously tough times, exceptionally historic tough times, and that we are on the right track, and we shouldn't stop now. We have to keep going. We have to stay the course, and you know, and we have to keep moving. And by re-electing me, you will give me the time that I need with my policies to really make things the way that everybody wants it to happen. And so that will be the argument that you will hear. Now, if you're asking me from a purely, if I go into my, like, you know, I'm a Democrat and an Obama supporter, you know, I will say, look, the economy, the bottom fell out of the economy right before he took office. We were in the worst economic situation since the Great Depression. And, you know, we are turning it around. We're nowhere near where we need to be, but we're clearly in much better shape than we were 4 years ago through some very specific things that the president has done. And so, you know, let's see. And then I would also say, let's see what the other side is proposing. And is their medicine any better than what the president has? And then I would try to make a case that what, you know, Governor Romney is going to propose isn't what the country needs. And so that's going to be the tension. Now, the thing that I will say is I was actually looking back when Ronald Reagan, who the Republicans and even Democrats, because, you know, I mean, he kicked our can twice when he ran and when he was reelected. When Ronald Reagan was when he entered office, the country had, I believe it was a 12.5% unemployment rate. It went up to somewhere around 16% unemployment. The day in November of 1984 when he was running for re-election, the unemployment rate was close to 11%. Right now, we have about an 8% unemployment rate. The economic miracle that you will hear Republicans talk about that happened during the Reagan years, unemployment didn't get under 8% until 1988, the last year of his second term in office. But Ronald Reagan carried 49 states in 1984. The only state he lost was Minnesota, where Walter Mondale was from and had represented as a senator, and Washington, D.C., which isn't a state, but which is heavily Democratic. And so why is that? Because, you know, if you were looking, as the question suggests, at the pure data, there wasn't much there. But what Ronald Reagan, President Reagan was a master at was, again, making the case, we've been through a lot, but think about your life in the future. And people will think, well, do I see my life better with him in office? And does he represent what I want to see in a president? And they had these wonderful ads politically called Morning in America. And it was, you know, the birds were chirping and the sun was coming up and kids were skipping to school and all that. And it said, you know, Reagan Bush is about morning in America. Well, it wasn't morning in America. You still had, you know, more people out of work then than are now. But you make people feel that. Like, okay, I'm going to, you know, it's like the slot machine. Like, all right, I'm going to put my quarter in one more time and pull the lever and hope for something. And so that's and frankly, you know, if I criticize my own side, Democrats were awful at portraying optimism. You know, I mean, I think in that election we were talking about, like, we're going to raise your taxes and life is awful. And well, who wants that? You know, that doesn't sound like much fun. I mean, all right. So you're saying I'm going to put you in office to make me feel worse than I am now? Well, no. And frankly, kind of, you know, I like to say that it took a while for Democrats to kind of get the lemon out of their mouth when they were campaigning. And you have to project a certain sense of, like, optimism, and that, like, you know, again, this goes back to the issue around the president who's also the monarch, where people want to see that, like, all right, you feel that, like, we're going to be in good shape. I don't want to hear that you had a hard day at work and our problems are hard and I have sleepless nights because I just don't know what we're going to do about it. I don't want to hear that if I'm a voter. I want to hear that, like, you've got a handle on this. You're going to come out and you're going to look me in the eye and say, this is the greatest country in the world, and sure, we have problems, but you know what? We're going to deal with that and move on. So, and frankly, it took someone like Bill Clinton, who is just by his nature just utterly optimistic, even on his worst day, to really kind of just project that sense of, like, yeah, you know, we got problems, but we'll fix that. So that's going to be key, I think, in this election as well, is the challenge that, you know, I think the challenge that, say, Governor Romney is going to have is, while attacking the president and criticizing, you know, what he's going to do, is does he project some sense of energy and optimism and not just sort of, you know, I mean, the shtick he has right now is that he's kind of this sort of, like, you know, not particularly exciting, et cetera. Well, that matters in terms of who people want to vote for. You know, I mean, in 2000, I'll say, you know, from the Al Gore, George Bush experience, I used to hate this, but it's true. They used to say, who would you rather have a beer with? Well, look, the reality is I don't want to give the code to launching nuclear weapons to the person I want to have a beer with. I can't think of any of my friends who should have the power to destroy the world. I don't know. You shouldn't get that. But the reality is that gut check for some people is really that kind of personal and visceral.
We're going to hear some of these issues come up in debates, and hopefully you all have an opportunity to see those. I think we've already gone through at least 20 debates on the Republican side, and there'll probably be 2, 3, maybe 4 between the Republican and President Obama. How much influence do they really have? I mean, people talk about winners and losers, and do they really have an influence anymore? I mean, you mentioned the Kennedy-Nixon debate as one where it clearly did.
You know, they can be decisive when there's a large number of people who are undecided. Now, certainly there have been some election races where, you know, Walter Mondale when he ran against President Reagan in 1984, he could have come out there and promised everybody ice cream and apple pie. And there probably wasn't much that those debates were going to do by the time you get into September, October. The Republicans kind of have that one sewn up for the most part. But I think the thing to look out for during these debates in the fall is what I call the moment. And there's sort of it could be a split-second issue that, or a grimace or something that happens that will either reinforce the prejudice that people may have against a candidate or highlight something about them that they're like, oh, I didn't realize that about you and I don't like you. You can really only hurt yourself in a debate. And let me give you 3 quick examples. 1988, Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, Democrat, ran against George Bush Sr. The first question of the debate was, Governor, you are against the death penalty. If your wife were sexually assaulted, would you want the person who committed the crime to receive the death penalty? And Michael Dukakis said, I am against the death penalty. I don't believe it's a deterrent. I don't believe it's morally right. And so, I'm just against the death penalty. I mean, okay, fine, if that's what you believe. But what happened was, people sitting at home, and particularly women, were saying, I'm sorry, your wife has been sexually assaulted, and if you don't want that to happen to if you don't want the death penalty to happen to the person who did it, how are you going to protect me? Who are you? I mean, do you have blood in your veins? Now, if I'm just being a pure political person, the answer should have been, I'm against the death penalty for ethical reasons. I don't believe it's a proper crime-fighting tool. But let me tell you, if someone assaulted my wife or harmed my family, you better believe I want something bad to happen to them. Now, but you aren't electing me as a husband. You are electing me as a president. But just to show that, like, you're a human being. Scene 1. And so, done. I mean, he was just gone. He could have packed up and moved back to Massachusetts. Scene 2, 1992. The economy was in bad shape, and President Bush Sr. was having a hard time getting traction on, like, trust me with the economy. And, and it wasn't a done deal yet with then Governor Clinton. And I remember to this day, they'll have different formats. And this format was the people in the audience got a chance to ask the candidates questions. And an African-American woman, maybe in her, 20s or 30s, stood up and asked the candidates, I have a job, but a lot of my friends are unemployed, and they're worried about how they're going to pay their bills. Do either of you know people who have lost their jobs, and what do you say to them? And President Bush spoke first, and I'll never forget it. The camera was on him, and you saw Governor Clinton sort of in the background, kind of a little shady. Not shady, but, in sort of he wasn't in total focus. And now that I've gotten to know him, he sort of turned in his seat and kind of got the look where it was like, oh, he's going to just knock this one out of the park. And if you've been to the baseball game, he was just going to that's his perfect question. So President Bush gave a fairly technocratic answer about his economic policies, and, it wasn't anything wrong with it, but it was just like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, fine. And Governor Clinton just got up off his stool and said, what's your name? And she said, Mary. She's like, well, let me tell you something. I'm governor of a small state. And so if someone loses their job, I probably know them and I know their family. And he had this very personal conversation about, I get it when people lose their job. And then he went on to his policy pivot of, when I know people who lose their job, I know the impact that the president's policies have had on them. And when I'm in the Oval Office, I'm going to know the people who lose their job and knocked it out of the park. And so if you're watching, and you're that undecided voter and you're worried about losing your job, that sends the frame like, okay, you get it. Last quick example. First debate between Al Gore and George Bush. Substantively, I mean, Al Gore was miles ahead of then Governor Bush. I mean, I can remember I was working on this thing at the time and sitting in, there was always like a room of people in the different campaigns, like following every quote and making sure that things are accurate and everything. And, I mean, it was to the point where Governor Bush would stop in the middle of some answers, just had ran out of material. So we're like, all right, we're feeling pretty good here. They had asked Vice President Gore about, Governor Bush had raised something about, you know, I loved how the federal government helped my state during some huge forest fires they had had. And the Vice President said, that's great, I remember visiting the fires. And I can remember sitting there in the little war room and kind of going, oh no, he didn't visit the fires, because you're not going to send the Vice President of the United States into fires. What he did do, he met with firefighters at the airport who were in the middle of the rescue operation. So, you know, I mean, for anyone reasonably, he has a connection to those fires, etc. Well, the issue had been that the press had been hounding him for saying that you lie about your background, you lie about this. And so because he wasn't 100%, if he had said, I remember being in Texas during that time, he would have been fine. But because that one little thing of like not flying into an active fire zone, as opposed to meeting firefighters in a safe spot, the press just that was the issue the next day. And then also during that debate, you know, I mean, they got into it, and on the Vice President's microphone, they picked up him sighing a couple of times when the governor would say something, and he would just go, and the microphone picked it up. And so the story the next day was, well, why is Al Gore sighing? And boy, isn't that impolite. That changed the entire sort of zeitgeist of the campaign going forward.
So maybe we'll have some surprises.
That's right.
We'll see.
Yes.
Keep posted. So we need to move through a little
Yes.
quicker. One of the issues that we have in this country is we get maybe 50 to 60% of the voters to come out on election day. And other countries it's much higher. Some countries it's a requirement. What do you think the biggest challenge is here? Why don't people go to vote?
You know, I think certainly one piece that I think we do make it fairly difficult, and it's getting better, but we do make it in some cases difficult for people to vote. Either the polls are not open, say on the weekend, like they are in some countries where people don't have to take time off from work, or sometimes if you're a student and you move from one state to the other, it's sometimes unclear where you're allowed to vote. And busy people, you wake up on election day and you're like, oh gosh, I'm not even registered. But I do think this goes back to perhaps a fault with our two-party system, in that some people may feel that because American politics shifts towards the center, and again, you're trying to get those undecided voters, that if you have strong feelings on one end or the other, some people may feel that, well, there isn't much of a difference between a Democrat or a Republican. I would disagree with that, but they feel that way, so what's the point? Or, if you are in certain states, if you're a Democrat in North Dakota or Mississippi, unless you're really motivated, chances are, you may not feel like your vote's going to matter, because Mississippi is not going to turn blue. It's not going to be a Democratic state. And if you're a Republican, chances are if you're in Massachusetts, if it rains or your kids have a soccer game, you may decide not to vote. And so it is a lot of time will be spent, and this is why I think you see the elections, the debates getting so heated, and you see these issues like abortion or guns or prayer. Not frankly because this is once someone's in office, they're going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on this, but what they're trying to find is like the one thing that just makes you mad. that will get you to go and vote, or the one thing that will scare you, or the one thing that really just ticks you off. And it's not going to be having an open, a nice, wonderful, friendly debate about economic policy. It's going to be something else, or like that candidate's just weird, whatever it is, whatever works, to get that number up, because moving 1 or 2 percentage points in a particular state can swing a whole election.
And that leads us, I think, to the next set of slides, which is the question of red states, blue states, swing states. I think you've heard that term a lot. What does that really mean? Obviously, is everybody in a blue state in New York Democratic? Probably not.
Right. The bottom line is, and for the presidential side, what you want to get is 50% plus 1 vote voting for you in the state. And so with the exception of Nebraska, I believe, presidents are elected by the Electoral College. They are not elected directly. And frankly, our founders were afraid of electing presidents directly. That they didn't think the people could handle it. And the number of Electoral College members equals your 2 senators plus the number of members of the House of Representatives in a state. So I think like New York maybe has like 24, I think. A less populous state like a North Dakota has 3. So that's what you're trying to get. You could frankly care less if you get over 50% of the national vote. And so when you hear about blue states, which refers to the more Democratic-leaning states, it just means that the majority of the voters who bother to vote are Democratic. Red states are Republicans. You'll see some of the states in yellow, the swing states, where it tilts, depending on who you can get out to vote and how. And so, this election season, you will see them in Ohio, Pennsylvania to a certain extent, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado. And they're just trying to find those few folks that will shift it one way or the other. In 2004, even though it seemed like a blowout victory for President Bush, Ohio is what put him back in office, and he actually won by less than 100,000 votes. Now people think, certainly September 11th had a big role to play in it, and et cetera. But what was interesting is in 2004, President Bush picked up, I believe it was 70,000 black voters that he did not get in 2000. And some of that, our country has moved on. What they did was the few black churches and community groups that would even talk to a Republican, they talked about same-sex marriage and really pushed the social conservative element in parts of the black community, and were able to get enough votes out of that. And so, again, you never know what little issue is gonna swing it.
So, I think we all think we're voting for the president. That our vote counts and whoever gets the majority is going to win. Is it possible for someone to win the popular vote, to actually get the most votes from all of us here and actually not become president?
Certainly, you can get. We've had some elections where you may get an extraordinary outpouring of support in the states that are more Democratic or Republican, but you don't get that magic 270 electoral votes, and then what that triggers is then the Congress decides who's president or vice president. In 2000, I believe Al Gore won the popular vote. Didn't matter. He didn't win the popular vote in Florida. And so, the rest is sort of history. And so you won't see, even though this isn't really a national election, it's really a bunch of state elections. It really comes down to about 10 or so states where candidates are really focusing on. And so, you could ask some presidential candidates right now, and they will know the neighborhoods in Pennsylvania that they carried. They won't know about what they got in New Mexico or Alaska, but they know where their margins are.
And why do Americans accept that?
You know,
Which is
it's
a common question I get when I'm overseas, so I'm figuring it's a question that you might.
Yeah. You know, I mean, this is sort of a cheap answer. It's kind of like, it's the way it is. It's how our framers created it. You know, that's what our Constitution, that's how our Constitution has structured it.
What would
you
be
know,
required to change it?
To change it, we would have to amend the Constitution, and that's a Herculean task.
That's what I want.
Where it has to, you have to pass a law through Congress. I believe it's even a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, which is a very difficult thing to do. And then it has to go to the states. And you know, I believe a majority, it's either a majority or 2/3 of the states, their legislatures have to agree to this. And so this can take decades and years. And so you could, let's say everyone in here just really cared about, like, this is ridiculous. We should have majority vote on the president, directly elected. Well, that's all great. But, you know, most people, you know, they'll be like, well, that's nice, but, you know, I'm more worried about whatever I'm worried about in my life. So you're going to have to raise the money, keep the attention focused on the issue, fight the ground war against a lot of interests who want to keep it the way it is. So you have to ask yourself, of all the things you care about, are you really that intense that you're willing to wage, it could be decades. Actually, I think the last amendment to our Constitution, it was something really simple, like, you know, congressional pay raises or something like that. It took 100+ years to get the final state to ratify it. I mean, it was like a random amendment. So that's what it would require.
It's not an easy government.
No.
So I'm going to skip a few here and just go to one of the last questions we got from Facebook. And it's related to sort of what kinds of issues can we expect in the election in 2012. And the specific question is talking about what role does foreign affairs play in the election, and maybe you could elucidate on some other key issues that you probably will be hearing a lot about in the next few months.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the bottom line is going to be the economy and jobs. Like, that's what's in everybody's mind. I'm going to be honest. Foreign affairs, the only extent that international affairs is important politically, not substantively, but politically, is if people feel that the president in office is going to get them killed or keep them safe. And, you know, you can see, you know, you can look on YouTube. There's a great Lyndon Johnson ad where the Republican he was running against was Barry Goldwater, who was a fairly, you know, pretty right-wing candidate at the time. And Lyndon Johnson had an ad of this little girl with a flower, and the song was singing, and she was picking off the little petals of the thing, of the flower. And when it got to the last one, you saw this mushroom cloud of a nuclear bomb go off. And it basically said that this man is too crazy to be president. This is not the time to put someone like him in office when, you know, we're less than 4 years from the Cuban Missile Crisis, when nuclear war was a serious issue. In 2004, George Bush was able to convince enough people in pretty graphic terms that your life is not safe if John Kerry's president. This time is going to be interesting because normally, frankly, Democrats have been at a disadvantage on national security issues. But look, I mean, Osama bin Laden is dead under President Obama's watch. The wars are winding down. And so from that, just pure who's going to keep you safe or who's going to get you killed sort of foreign policy, you know, question. It's, you know, it will be advantage to the president because he's the sitting president. And he can say, well, wait a minute, you know, you're going to put someone who has no national security experience in office. And frankly, my national security record from the issues that people vote on are pretty strong.
Well, with that, we've gone through sort of all the standard questions and want to be sure we gave you all an opportunity to ask some questions. And I know he brought up some provocative issues. So let me just turn it over to you. What questions might you all have?
Ask anything. I may not answer it, but you can ask it.
You were mentioning a lot the swing voters, and so I'm wondering if the whole political campaign is really focused on the swing voters, and how set are people in their ways of being a Democrat or being a Republican?
Mm-hmm. I think there are two pieces. One, you will focus attention on getting out your core supporters, the people who are core Democrats or core Republicans, because you want them to show up. So it's mobilizing, it's getting them energetic. And so that's where you will see, again, some issues that come up that you're like, why are they talking about marriage, or why are they talking about, abortion, let's say. And part is because there are some, strong feelings that people have about those issues, but partly it's because your core supporters will get out on just that issue. But a lot, I would say, 2/3 of your energy is focusing on the people, who are sitting at home, who aren't, they may be a Democrat, but they voted for Republicans. They may be a Republican, but they voted for Democrats, or they may not be anything. They're just people. And they're sitting there going, all right, what am I doing? And some people literally don't decide until they walk into the voting booth. And so a lot of energy is focused on either lifting yourself up, or, I hate to say it, but the hard truth is you want to slash and burn your opponent enough that even if the person doesn't really like you, they really don't like that other person. And so they're like, well, it's like, well, all right, it's still a vote.
You can't help notice that both of you did not refer to the Democratic frontrunner as the candidate. Is there really a chance in the convention, for somebody else to ride in on a white stallion as a Christian conservative and really
On the Republican side.
On the Republican side and really be the nominee instead of the current frontrunner, as you refer to him?
No. And I say this because the rule, most of the delegates who show up, and I can't remember where their convention is this year, most of them have to follow the decision of their state. So unless there's a pretty, go ahead.
But that is sort of at the core of at the heart of the question. Do they have to? Are they legally bound to that? Or could they swing if they felt they had to?
Some states you can. Some states, in theory, you show up and you're a free agent and you just do what you do. But really, once the machinery kind of kicks in, and if you're, say, the Republican Party of Michigan, and that the governor has won that state, who you select as the delegate to be there, you're going to make sure that it's a Romney person. You aren't going to pick somebody who just thinks they have a free mind and free vote. So there are all sorts of ways the machinery makes sure. Because frankly, the last thing that, now you're going to have, like, Ron Paul will give a speech, and you'll give some people, they'll give their speech, you give them time, and you move them on. The last thing you want as a party is to have this utter nutty chaos convention where, again, voters are sitting at home kind of going, well, you don't want it looking like the nightclub scene from Star Wars where people are just all running around and looking weird, and that doesn't help you, 10 weeks from now during an election. So I think now, yeah.
There is an ongoing media hype about President Obama coming out about the gay marriage issue, and I think we've witnessed a lot of, we've seen a lot of analysis through the media, and my question is, what do you think he chose? Why do you think he chose this specific moment to come to have a clear-cut opinion about gay marriage?
Mm-hmm. I think they had, and he has talked about, they had clearly been discussing this issue inside the White House, and as he said, his sort of view on marriage itself, as opposed to, say, civil unions or other things, had evolved. Now, one of the issues that you had seen is that the vice president came out, was it 2 weeks ago, during an interview, and say he was for same-sex marriage, and so that kind of, okay, even if you aren't ready to talk about it, well, your vice president has, so you have to accelerate it. My personal view is that I think the debate had evolved so much, and there's just so much momentum had developed around gay and lesbian issues. You have the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and gays and lesbians serving in the military. You had a number of other issues that you could not have had this. I mean, just from let's take the moral dimension, let's take the ethical dimension out of this. Let's just pure business. You're just trying to win an election. I don't know if you could have had this conversation 8 years ago. Just from a pure, which voters are you going to attract, which voters are you going to repel? The country's debate on this issue had not evolved. The conversation had not evolved. Today, in some ways, while I think it was certainly, and for folks who feel strongly on either side of the equation, it's a big deal to have the president speak out on it. But in most cases, it was almost like all right, because they had seen in just polling generally about gay and lesbian issues that, particularly for younger voters and even sort of middle-aged, voters, where the issues were 8, 16, whatever years ago would have just been a real dividing issue. People were like, well, I don't really care anymore. It's just not a very interesting topic for me. So, with an issue like that, and this happened, say, during the civil rights movement, I think we would like to believe that a president can be out front and leading a charge. From a pure business point of view, frankly, you have to calibrate to make sure that while you are leading, you are not so far out front that the country isn't ready. Particularly, and people have faulted, John Kennedy wasn't particularly aggressive on civil rights when he ran for president. He sort of was, Richard Nixon was frankly more pro-civil rights. But look, he said, look, I have to do my deal here. I need the southern states. So, from a political point of view, it's like, what's better? Do you want the slightly better candidate in office so that you frankly have the opportunity to go into the Oval Office and push him or her on it? Or do you want to sort of fight on principle and lose the election? It really depends. And and it's a tension that always exists. But yeah, I just think the country had just kind of blown on through that issue a bit.
Well, basically, he now wins more than he repels.
Absolutely.
As you said,
That's
8
right.
years ago probably would have repelled more, and now it's...
That's right. I mean, the voters who are staunchly against same-sex marriage aren't voting for him anyway. And then frankly, I just think it became the point, and this is what I think probably happened with the vice president. Well, this is what we believe. Like, I can't sit here and have an interview and just sort of like not say something that's like where we've made a clear decision.
Maybe we could have one more question.
In France, there is also as well a presidential election, and sometimes
closer than it was expected. Yeah.
Sometimes the candidate that has lost has become the president many years after, like sometimes 7 years after. Has this ever happened in the US, and could this happen?
It has happened. I mean, I think the most recent where the person has been the nominee has been Richard Nixon, who lost in 1960 and came back in 1968. I don't know if that could, in this modern era, I don't know, because generally once a candidate has lost, the sort of party apparatus kind of says, look, we just put a whole lot of energy into you and a whole lot of money. It's time to sort of move on. And then I just think once you've gone through the gauntlet of running for president, you have to really, really want it again. Taking those apple pies in Iowa again, and I mean, you're like,
Well,
really?
Mitt Romney's done it now twice.
Right.
He's
He hasn't been the
running twice.
nominee,
He
but
hasn't
yeah,
won.
I mean, you do get the folks who haven't won their nominations, and they just, they keep their donor list, and they just keep kind of going, and eventually it's like, well, all right, come on in, let's see if you can do it this time. But I think someone who is actually a party's nominee, I think it's tricky, unless say the next presidential election, there were just so many like weak candidates that we don't keep our sort of elder statesmen and women in our parties who've lost elections very well.
How about like in Russia, where you're president, you're not, and then you come back?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
It's happened here
talk
once.
about yes, talk about.
When did that happen?
It was who was it? It was
Wasn't it
Adams. Oh gosh,
Grover Cleveland.
Cleveland.
Won once and then lost for 4 years and came back and won
Came
again.
back.
But it'll never happen again.
No, yeah, we wouldn't do that again. We'd be like, what did you not understand? We just.
So I think I have one last question that
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody really wants to know is, when are you running for president?
Oh gosh, no, I don't want to raise $1 billion and take apple pies around and you know.
Well, I
I'd probably
think
say
we-
something too silly, so I couldn't probably get actually elected. So.
Well, you've got the qualities to do it. We thank you very much for all of your time.
Right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, Trooper. That
Thank
was
you.
really insightful, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks whoever's out there. Thank you.
Bye-bye.